at the top of the hour, so why don't we get started? We are recording today's session, so if you don't consent to being recorded, please end your participation now. Hi everyone, I'm John Bistline from the Electric Power Research Institute. I'd like to begin by thanking the Macro Energy Systems Steering Committee for organizing this speaker series. I'd also like to thank everyone in the macro energy systems community, especially those who are able to attend today's webcast. So if the number of registrations is any indication, I think there were about 100. There's a lot of interest in the topic of how advanced technologies could shape future energy systems. So by way of introduction, to those of you who are joining the macro energy systems speaker series for the first time, MES is an emergent field and also a research community that focuses on large-scale, systems-level, and long-term aspects of energy systems, as well as their implications for other systems, including the environment, the economy, and human well-being. The topic of advanced energy technologies is an important one in energy systems, macro energy systems research. So we thought it would be valuable today to hear from some of the leading researchers within this space. And I'm delighted to have three very distinguished speakers that have agreed to be part of today's panel. And I'm going to start by giving brief bios of all three, and then we'll have opening remarks from each of the panelists. And then I'll moderate a question and answer session, including questions from you all. So you have the option to enter Q&A within Zoom, and I'll be curating those over the course of today's webcast. So in terms of today's panelists, the first is Professor Gregory Nemet, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's La Follette School of Public Affairs. He holds the Saul Swedell Distinguished Faculty Chair in Business and Regulation. He's also a Billis Distinguished Achievement Professor. His research focuses on understanding the process of technological change and the ways in which public policy can affect it. He wrote an excellent book on how solar energy can provide lessons for the development of other low carbon technologies as well. And he was a lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's 6th Assessment Reports. It's great to work with Greg on the Energy Systems chapter in Working Group 3. Panelist 2 is Dr. Geoffrey Blanford, who's a Principal Technical Executive at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI. Dr. Blanford is a leading expert on the integrated assessment and energy modeling, energy economic modeling. His research activities include the development of analytical tools, including the US Regen model and MERGE, with applications ranging from electricity markets to end-use electrification and economy-wide decarbonization and international climate policy. He was also a lead author in the IPCC's 5th Assessment Report, and he serves as the co-director of the International Energy Workshop, the IEW. Our third panelist today is Dr. Ozge Kaplan, a senior research engineer at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development. Dr. Kaplan is an expert in energy systems modeling, energy, environmental, and societal interactions, uncertainty analysis, as well as decision support. Her research focuses on characterizing end-use technology and fuel trends within buildings, transport, and industrial sectors. Dr. Kaplan is also the lead developer of EPA's city-based optimization model for energy technologies called COMET. So we'll now turn to opening remarks, roughly 3 minutes per panelist. And here, you all accepted our invitation to speak on the topic of advanced energy technologies. So how do you define advanced technologies, and why are they worth our time and attention? So we'll start with Greg first.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about technological change and advanced technologies, what I'm looking at is improvements in technology at kind of a technology level. And from a systems perspective, the adoption of them. And we've seen a lot of technological change. We've seen renewables grow. Before that, we saw nuclear. Fracking has made a big impact, especially in the US. And before that, we've seen larger systematic transitions like the shift from wood to coal to oil. So those are all of the things that we know have happened in the past. And those are the types of things that we're going to have to somehow understand and model and plan for in a forward-looking perspective. One of the things about that I find interesting about technological change is it makes things possible that were not before. It can diminish some trade-offs and it can introduce new types of trade-offs. For example, I often talk about the need that people want energy that's cheap, that's clean and reliable, but we disagree on which is the most important of those three. And in the best case, technological change and new technologies can at least diminish some of the trade-offs we have, and so that we can have outcomes that are affordable and feasible when things go in the right direction like that. Doesn't always work like that when we have technological change, but that's kind of part of the direction and the opportunity that exists. And then in terms of, how do we make sense of it and understand it? From my perspective, I rely on the literature on innovation more generally, like outside of energy and climate, to figure out like what do we know about how technologies improve and how to assess them and model them. And it's a tricky literature in a way because it often emphasizes idiosyncrasy and context and the specifics of a particular case. And so what we have is a lot of outcomes that focus on how there's heterogeneity, that outcomes are often skewed. Like we'll do a bunch of bets, and one of them will turn out to be really big and important, and a lot of them won't really happen. And it's really hard to tell ahead of time which ones are going to win and which ones are going to not really go anywhere. So we have, insights like that that are helpful but not really guiding. But one of the the outcomes from the literature I think is particularly robust is that we can take technology seriously when they combine a technological opportunity with a market opportunity. And if we look historically, successful technologies somehow combine something new that's changed on the supply side of innovation and technology, some new knowledge, some new how-to, some new information. And on the other hand, that there's interest in it, that there's new features that are created, there's some advantage over existing technologies, there's a market opportunity. And those can lead to successful technologies. And sometimes we need policy to help reconcile and patch up the creation of the technology or the creation of some demand or stimulation of markets for them. So, yeah, so that's one way I think about new technologies that come on and how we might decide to take them seriously or not, and then how to model them. So I often use the past and use literature to do that.
Great. Thanks, Greg. That was a terrific overview. Jeff, you're up next.
Great. Thanks, John. And yeah, thanks to MES for putting this together. This is a fun series. Really glad to be here with these panelists. And, I have a little bit of a different perspective than Greg, who's sort of looking at the, really the sort of organic sort of process of how technological change happens. I run energy system models, develop energy system models to look at sort of transition scenarios where we try to achieve longer term decarbonization goals, longer term goals around improved reliability and resilience of the energy system. And advanced energy technologies are sort of anything that makes that easier, and particularly things that really have low deployment today, where you can see in these scenarios that if they were to exist at economic or with economic improvements that made them or policy changes that made them viable investments, they could really change our ability to achieve these goals around the energy system. And I think when we look at those goals, they really do depend on significant technology advance, and that's why this is such an important question. How can we use our models and our analysis to communicate the value of advanced technology or technology advancements in the direction that makes our goals more feasible? And I'm sort of reminded of a talk that we were fortunate to have Bill Nordhaus at a recent IW, and he was working on a study on international trade as a lever to enforce coalitions around carbon reductions. And sort of the conclusion that he came to, which at first he thought was a sort of pessimistic conclusion, was that there really wasn't enough. If you were to use trade as a lever to enforce participation in a coalition, you really couldn't get reductions that cost more than $50 a ton of CO2. And I thought that was an interesting calculation, interesting framing. And at first he thought, wow, we'll never get there. We'll never get to these stabilization goals. And then he sort of turned it around and said, actually, no, what we need is for technology to make the marginal cost of reductions, or to reduce the cost of reductions, such that we can get there at $50 a ton, if that's kind of the most that we'd be willing to pay. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because whether you're thinking about international coalition formation as a driver for affordability, but there are many other sort of institutional constraints where lower costs of abatement make things easier, or are political constraints or other types of constraints in terms of actually implementing these goals. It's always going to be easier the more affordable we can make it, whether that's equity, whether that's the speed of the transition. So technological change that can bring those goals within reach is really sort of at the center of solving the the crisis that we're all working on.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Ozge, over to you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, my name is Ozge Kaplan. I'm with EPA. Thank you, John and MES, for inviting me and then organizing this. I think this is a very timely and important aspect in terms of both deployment of advanced technologies in real life and also as a modeler, energy system modeler, like how we account them in our modeling systems. So I think in terms of energy systems modeling, the way I view the advanced technologies, like as the previous panelists also echoed, is something like pivotal innovations that could enhance the efficiency of the system, make it more sustainable, and then like the reduce emissions. And also like economic vitality is very important too, like the economies of the economy has to work for these technologies to come in. Otherwise, they won't be there. So, but then there is, we think about them within the modeling, like both like supply and demand sides. There's always like these type of opportunities for the energy system. So it's not just like the power sector advanced technology. So the both sides will have different. So I think in terms of, especially I'm going to talk more about the industrial sector as well. It's like very important in the industrial sector. And from our EPA perspective, we look at like the emission reduction. So then, because that impacts human health. And a lot of times decision makers like rely on these modeling and planning for different strategies to inform policy. So having these aspects of advanced technology, unintended consequences, I think it's very important to incorporate in our systems. And the key questions, like we can actually look back to history, the way the advanced technology actually come and then transition our energy system is one of them. It's like very in the near future, the shale gas revolution, which actually led to these different price dynamics in terms of making gas really cheaper. So then the adoption of gas in the power sector took off, and it actually led to a lot of like emission reductions, not just CO2, but the air pollution as well. So that's like really like important. And then many of the models actually missed that. Like in the 90s, if you look at like older studies, you see a lot of like the coal growth. You don't see gas growth because back then the gas prices were really low. So if this is like a near-term things happen, and then over the years, I think with the industry, not many people see this, but then some of the heavy industries actually changed fuels in the due to the cheap natural gas prices, like the iron and steel sector, like adopted direct reduced iron technology, which actually removes, it's almost like a cokeless technology to make the iron ore, like the reduced iron ore. And then the chemicals industries actually make like different adoptions in terms of like basically not relying on crude oil to natural gas liquid. So you're almost like bypassing the refining and then directly going to the ethylene production to do the chemicals. So these things are, I think, really important in terms of like this historic like oversight. It's like it should be, I think, crucial reminder. So then we need to be like adaptable in our modeling. So I think, yeah, that's probably might be over time. Yeah. So I think so we'll talk more in the upcoming minutes.
Perfect timing, Ozge. So next, I want to turn to a few targeted questions for our panelists, although the other panelists can feel free to chime in as well. The first one I have is for Greg. So Greg, how do you see the role of technological change affecting energy system transitions and decarbonization? And specifically, I'm curious from your research, what are effective strategies for realizing not just those cost reductions for technologies, but potential performance improvements as well, especially in the context of these emerging technologies?
Yeah, I mean, technological change, I mean, Jeff said this and Ozge too. It's crucial, and it's the improvements in the technologies that we need to see, but it's also their adoption within the system, and both of those play a big role. And because the energy system is so big and it's global, and because the climate system is so big, we're interested in the longer term in really widespread adoption. And so technologies that play a role in affecting the climate and the energy system have to have the ability to scale, to get big enough to make a difference, but also on a pace that makes them relevant in the time scale that we think about, which is, mid-century net zero emissions or something along those lines. And so that to a lot of people is outside their day-to-day planning, but for the modeling that the others on this panel do, that's like tomorrow. And from someone who studies technological change, it's almost too late for some technologies that are just kind of bubbling up in the lab. To think that they might be big enough to make a difference in 2050 just belies the historical experience. So what we really need are technologies that are moving quickly, that are getting better, and often that have some niche, so that there's some way that they can, when they're small and don't have scale yet and are unfamiliar and maybe more expensive than they ultimately will be, that there's still a place for them. There's still a place where people have high willingness to pay, or that they're not competing with mature industries that have very low costs or very large scale. And so that sometimes there's a natural niche, like for solar, it was uh, you know, Japanese companies putting solar panels onto watches and things like that, or the space program where electricity was really valuable and solar had an edge. So those didn't need policy, but other cases, policy can play a role by creating a niche, by having an extra price or an extra incentive that you get for getting up to scale. And then if you have some sequence of niches where you can say, okay, first we'll start with the space program, and then we'll move to watches and calculators, and then we'll move to off-grid people, and then we'll move to other people that have high willingness to pay. And then at very later, we can compete with fossil fuels. That, for solar has been a really effective strategy, and electric vehicles are doing something similar to that too. So when you see a sequence of niches, that's a pathway that makes it credible that a technology can actually play a big enough role in a short amount of time.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And I guess one question in the chat from Amy Curtright is about thinking about how markets and technology intersects with externalities and policy to potentially affect those and correct for those externalities. Those may be externalities related to emissions. There may also be positive externalities related to innovation. How do you see public policy playing a role, especially in the creation of those niche markets?
Yeah, it can play a big role, and we've seen it happen in the past where policy can create an incentive, like with a tax credit or something like that, or directly with regulation. And we've seen that with catalytic converters for cars or pollution controls for power plants. That created a market when you said that every power plant that burns gas has to put a selective catalytic reduction unit on it. And it led to lots of innovation in those because all of a sudden there was a market. But there wouldn't have been a market if there wouldn't been some regulation that said, actually, if you have a certain size and a certain amount of emissions, you actually have to reduce your NOx emissions. So yeah, policy can play a really big role in creating markets. And as you suggested too, there's also this well-known knowledge spillover externality, so that we don't invest enough in science and research and education because the benefits are freely available to all. So that's why we have government R&D, and that's why we have public education, and that's why we fund technologies that aren't up to scale yet. And so there's policy that can play a role on the stimulating innovation side, and policy can play a role on creating market side. And those have generally been really important. And then if you've got some kind of natural characteristic of the technology getting better on its own, or there's some niche where you don't actually need policy, but it's not big enough to address the energy transition, but it's big enough to satisfy some need, like rich people that wanted performance electric vehicles 10 years ago. That didn't need policy. That was a niche that got the technology started and eventually led to the road for costs to come down and performance to improve so that you could start to use policy and then maybe ultimately not need policy at all. So yeah, there is kind of this pathway of using policy a lot at the beginning, shifting it, and eventually relying less on it.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So the second question I have is for Jeff. How does energy system modeling take into account these emerging and advanced technologies, and how could advancing technologies then influence things like energy system reliability and affordability, given those uncertainties about future systems that others have articulated already?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, modeling technological change is, as I said, sort of central to what we do. And I guess I want to touch on one really important distinction, methodological distinction is you sort of have to make a choice when you're approaching these questions is whether you're going to model technological change sort of endogenously, where you're actually describing the process by which technological change happens, and that's sort of a decision variable within the model, or exogenously, you're just assuming a technology cost performance curve over time. And I think, Greg's done a lot of great work and others, of course, to inform kind of how you might parameterize an endogenous relationship. And of course, there is an endogenous relationship in the real world. These learning curves are real. It's deployment experience as well as research inputs that drive down the cost and achieve these advances through innovation. But it's actually very difficult to sort of empirically estimate and kind of model within a numerical setting. And apart from sort of not being able to sort of reliably empirically estimate that relationship, between the parameters and the learning curve, it also creates a non-convexity in the optimization that you're running, which really increases computational burden. You're sort of trading off a future pay down of a cost that has a future value, or a current pay down of a cost that has a future value, and so you're kind of deciding whether to go down that path or not. That's a really important question, but I think it's difficult for models to answer, and often models choose the other path, which is to sort of exogenously specify a technology path, or a path over time for the technological parameters like cost and performance. So the difficulty with that is you sort of get this. Okay, I've waited around until 2045 when the policy signal has gotten stronger and the technologies have improved, and now I'm ready to invest in CCS, and so now I go buy a bunch of it. And it's just sort of there for me. And of course, in the real world, that's not how it works. You really need that deployment experience, and you need, Greg framed it really well. This sort of, I like the sequence of niches, right? You need these steps along the way to create that. So you can get this sort of deceptive impression from a model with exogenous technical change that, that this is a future event that will just sort of occur, and that's an important thing to disabuse ourselves of. So policy support, and especially when we're talking about things like carbon capture that really are not going to have a market without a policy incentive, and other technologies that are going to play a role to achieve a policy goal that is addressing an externality that that wouldn't be addressed necessarily by private markets. Really need that policy support to drive them initially, and so you can. I think what the value of running these models with exogenous technological changes, you can test what the value of having achieved a technological milestone is in the future, and that's how we often frame the work that we do. So we run in different scenarios where, okay, suppose we see this set of technologies is available at these costs. How does that make achieving these goals cheaper, easier, more feasible? How does that lower some of the barriers? And then you can sort of use that to inform kind of what a program of R&D support or adoption policy support earlier on to make sure that those technology goals are met. And then the other piece in all of this is, right, there's just tremendous uncertainty. When I think back to the technologies that were in the model when I started modeling 20 years ago, and the technologies that are in the model now, if I was judged on whether I anticipated sort of all the things that are important now based on what I was assuming for my model in 2030 and 2050, I think that I would come up very poorly. Energy storage, there was nothing on energy storage when you were modeling in the early 2000s, at least not in our models. Electric vehicles, we started. I mean, this was the far-reaching thing: is, oh well, gosh, if these costs of batteries come down, then maybe this would start to make a difference. Renewables, the same thing. Well, they're probably never going to be too big, but maybe if the costs come down, and you start to think about just how much progress there has been in that time period, not only in the technologies that we see now, but the technologies that we're now anticipating could play a role in the future. There's just there's so many exogenous drivers that you just have to sort of keep updating the model and keep sort of moving the yardstick to reflect what's happening. But it's very important to have that long perspective with technological change.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. So Ozge, you've done a lot of research looking at industrial decarbonization in particular. I'm curious about how you see the role of advanced energy technologies in industry, and the sort of broader question, like, is industrial decarbonization hard to decarbonize, hard to model, or is that not a fair dichotomy?
Well, yeah, thanks, John. So the industry is a beast, if you think about it. And then as far as advanced technology, there are very much like advancements in the industry, right? There's smart manufacturing, automation, AI. But then when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there is like the need for all these like CCS, DAC, and hydrogen. So then the question becomes like, you need policy or some type of incentive to reduce the emissions. And then as far as like industrial decarbonization, in the real world application, I think, yes, it's hard because of the heterogeneity of the industry. And then there are some sectors within the industry that's very hard to decarbonize, like iron and steel, chemicals, and cement, due to the process emissions. The way we make those goods inherently makes it really energy intensive and also like emission intensive as well. So then the question is like, you need to look at like how the industry is growing, right? And within the US, the heavy manufacturing, maybe it's not too prominent, but we do have this non-manufacturing energy growth happening, like with the food industry, data centers. So that actually requires a lot of electricity. So then the energy efficiency plays a huge role. So in modeling all this, like you'll see like these little improvements like across the industry. It's really hard to tell like which one will make the big impact. So then that brings the question of, is industry hard to model? Yes, it's hard to model because you can miss some of the opportunities that's like out there, like if you do not include them in your modeling. So in the recent study we did with the Energy Modeling Forum, actually we looked at ensemble of model results where a lot of different modeling groups submitted their results for reference and net zero runs. And then what we see is like not a clear pattern. So it's just like the models pretty much like use whatever they have in their model to reduce emissions, but we see a lot of reliance on carbon removal technologies, for instance. So then it boils down to economics. Like without proper economics, these things are not going to come in, because also the industry's risk awareness, like the industry, in most of the heavy industries, they don't change stuff unless it breaks. So it just, there's like a certain things. It's just really like the economics is like has to be there. So then they can just like make the change and then just leapfrog the thing. So it's really like interesting, the industry thing. So it just, they need like more better like modeling data and that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a clear need for the macro energy systems community. There's several efforts aimed at that now. So great to hear. So in terms of questions for all of the panelists, I want to start with one that relates to, I see one of the questions in the chat here. Data centers and AI are the topic du jour right now, not just in energy circles, but beyond. And to power those data centers, especially with companies like Google, Microsoft announcing these 24/7 carbon-free energy goals. How should we think about the role of advanced technologies in relation to those targets, including things like advanced nuclear, geothermal, long-duration energy storage? Could this type of procurement help to bridge that so-called valley of death and help move from, say, first of a kind, nth of a kind? I'm curious about how you think about that.
I can jump in if you like. I think definitely especially like I can see a big value in the small modular reactors, but they're, I think, still expensive. So the economies of scale is not there since they're smaller. But also they can be co-located with these data centers, so they can be even like isolated from the grid, and then but then there's the uncertainty of like how the data center demand is going to increase or not, right? So we just this news on DeepSeek, like actually like improving the algorithms. So the demand projections are very uncertain as well. So it's, I think, really interesting, like modeling exercise, like capturing these uncertainties, both in the demand side, and then how can you provide electricity, 24/7 electricity. And then the 24/7 electricity is needed for large population centers too. So that brings this other issue as well. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. Yeah, sure. We'll go reverse order, Greg, and then you can have the last word on this one. But I think there's definitely an opportunity here, and I mean, there's also a tension with a lot of the data center applications. They see this as a sort of technology race. They're trying to get these operations up as fast as possible, but they also have these corporate CFE targets, and it's like, how do you square a project like an advanced nuclear technology that it's going to take a while to build, even in the best of even the most optimistic assumptions, with this sort of need for or perceived need to sort of rapidly add capability to run these models and sort of establish a lead in the space. So at the same time, you have an application where it seems like the value is perceived to be so high that sort of cost is no object, and they're trying to move as fast as they can and have a lot of capital. That's a good recipe that's a niche that could definitely support. And if you combine that with a willingness to try some of these new technologies that would support a 24/7 CFE kind of profile, then you do have the opportunity for that kind of project or that kind of activity to make a meaningful improvement in move down a learning development curve that would benefit the broader prospects for technologies like like advanced nuclear or some of these other low carbon baseload options or long duration storage that are being considered.
Yeah, and maybe just picking up on Jeff's point about the speed and the race he was describing, I feel like that's such an important characteristic of how the data centers and the AI work is moving. And to me, it doesn't quite fit with this idea of procuring a brand new energy supply source like small modular reactors, which seems unlikely to really have substantial deployment before like the mid 2030s. And so much could change between now and then in terms of data center demand. So yeah, it feels like a kind of a funny combination of looking for an answer that's going to take a while to get there in a race that's so urgent and so massive and competitive. So yeah, I think that's one thing. But I think also data centers are good to put in the context of just a big change in the US, which is growing electricity demand. And that's been, 15 or almost 20 years of flat demand. And then all of a sudden with data centers plus electrification of vehicles, plus electrification of heat, you have all of a sudden the need to grow supply or at least manage that demand in some way. So data centers are part of a broader set of needing a lot more electricity in the US compared to the past where it was such a slow growth that you could make planning decisions about technologies that might take 10 or 15 years and have the patience. But now I don't think the patience is really an option because the demand's going so quickly, not just from data centers.
Great. Thank you all. And so I guess a follow-up question, there's tremendous uncertainty in thinking through technologies even a couple years in advance, let alone along these longer time frames. And I think the historical track record of several prominent technologies should give us all pause, especially when some of these are systematic, under projections. I guess I'm reminded of this cottage industry that every couple of years, people show the IEA projections for solar deployment on how those have lagged massively. I'm curious about, your thoughts on what lessons the macro energy systems community should learn from those examples. How should we alter our models and our analysis or communications about our modeling and analysis?
I think that's a question for the modelers, I guess. Yeah, but I could chime in maybe after them.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very challenging to know. I mean, we have, I think, a reasonable a set of technologies to look at in maybe the next decade, right? Like people often say, like if you haven't heard of a technology now, it's probably not going to be deployed, within the next, by 2030 or 2040. In fact, it's hard to imagine. I think Greg mentioned this earlier. Like 2050 is kind of just around the corner. It's actually hard to imagine a technology we've never heard of being deployed in 2050. But at the same time, right? Like we hadn't heard of AI at this scale a few years ago. The shale revolution is another example where I think that probably came out of sort of nowhere. I mean, if you were really into that space, you might have seen it coming, but that had really far-reaching implications that were not in any model. And other kind of broader changes, sort of socioeconomic changes that are going to be really impossible, like pandemics, for example, really impossible to predict. So I think a level of humility is important here, and also remembering that we're running these models out to 2050 because it's important. You have long-lived capital stock. You have climate variables that are moving at these timescales where it's really important to capture multi-decade time horizon. But we're trying to inform the next round of decisions, and that's it. This is a repeated game. We're trying to make investments in this current period. We're going to learn. We're going to uncertainty about the technologies and then the rest of the space. We're going to learn how the performance of our decisions in the last round went. So there's going to be another round of modeling next year and the year after that. So we're trying to make the best decision that we can make with the information that we have. So I think trying to take a risk management approach with not just technology uncertainty, but in general uncertainty is the most effective framing for what these models are used for.
I can add a couple other points, like on Jeff's points. The one thing also we try to do is like the scenario analysis, right? So we try to capture like certain bound of uncertainties through different scenarios, whether it's like technological, economic, and policy developments. And as far as I think modeling, maybe sometimes modelers can be so attached to their own models, like they don't want to just explore other type of modeling or insights. So I think there's a value, I think sometimes like for some stuff to take a look back and say, okay, maybe my model is not the best way to capture this, so let's just look at some other, like for capturing, let's say, the system impacts, like the pandemic type stuff. Maybe an optimization model might not be a good fit, but we can do more like a systems dynamics model. And I think the other issue is to capture these things, you almost, I think, have to be like a little detective, like, and then it's like puzzle, and then just like sniff the stuff, like the like I try to read sometimes like industry trade journals, or like talking with, I think, different stakeholders also helps, because they can tell you things that having like all like real time happening, what's going on. So then you can actually infer like different, oh, maybe this is going to come in the future, that type of stuff. So I think those things are having like going outside your modeling box to engage with industry, government. I think those things would be like really helpful. But of course, like you always, we've met a lot of times, like I think if you look back in history, modelers, I think we missed some trends. I think there's a saying like all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think our models, we try to be useful in terms of providing insights. Yeah.
Yeah, and just maybe on that issue, yeah, that you raised, John, about some of these like there's a group of technologies when you look at them, they've exceeded expectations, like solar, electric vehicles to a lesser extent, wind power, and then a group of technologies that have disappointed expectations, like nuclear power and CCS. And it does seem to be persistent is that we continue to underestimate some of these technologies that have exceeded and continue to kind of bank on, plan for some of these technologies like nuclear and CCS that have grown very slowly and but would need to grow quickly to make a difference. So I guess on one hand we see that pattern and it's kind of surprising that we don't pick up on it. On the other hand, it's really hard to distinguish between which technologies are going to improve and get adopted and which ones are going to disappoint. And for whatever reason, whether it's cost or public acceptance or something else, just not make the mark that you would expect them to have. And I think that's, at least from an empirical perspective, that's the question that's kind of recurring that I get a lot is how do we know which technologies are going to learn and which are not going to learn, which are going to improve and which are going to stay stagnant? It makes a huge difference. And that's a hard question. I mean, some of the things that have come up that people have suggested are the scale of the technologies, and that's kind of really changed my thinking from what I learned in grad school. Like it now really seems like small scale technologies can go faster than large scale technologies, and in a sense that small scale technologies can scale bigger than big technologies, big unit scale technologies. That was the opposite of what I learned in grad school, and so there's limitations to how far that hypothesis can go, but it does explain quite a bit if you think of the uptake in some of these technologies have gone faster than expected, like electric vehicles and solar and small scale technologies like heat pumps and things like that.
Yeah, Greg, maybe I'll just add something to that. I think it's really important to, this idea that we can't pick the winners necessarily. And so one of the insights that if you run a bunch of scenarios with a range of different possible outcomes across this mix, you kind of reach the conclusion that this sort of full portfolio approach is like really important. It's important insight from this modeling that the more kind of, especially on the R&D side, right? The more avenues you keep possibly open, because there are scenarios when even technologies that in most scenarios don't play a big role or don't have value. There are scenarios where something goes wrong in other cases and you really need this, and so having having that broad set of options is especially from this in the presence of so much uncertainty is really very valuable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Great. So I want to combine a couple of questions from the chat with something that's really on the front of my mind and probably others, is that in the sort of current political moment, not just in the US, but globally, there's a sense that there might be restrictions on trade, including tariffs. There's, sort of regulatory whiplash in some cases where incentives are either rolled back or changed. How do those factors influence the path of technological change? I could see, in some sense, the lower R&D funding, right, may make technologies develop less quickly. But you could also, point to the induced innovation work that, think that famous QJE paper by Newell et al. Suggests that if you have these changes in prices, that potentially that induces, innovation along, certain lines. So how do you think about, those different drivers related to trade, policy, and R&D shaping?
I just briefly I'm curious to hear the others too. One thing from my perspective, like I remember doing interviews in Beijing in March of 2018, and the person we were trying to interview was late, and this government official, and the reason he was late is that China was trying to figure out how they would retaliate to the U.S. tariffs on aluminum, and they came up with soybeans, and it took them a while to figure out what it was that they were importing from the U.S. But that, like, to me, that was like, whoa, that's not what I expected, because the whole story that I've been working on with the solar story, and I've seen it with other technologies too, is this super global innovation system where, you had these Chinese companies started by people that were trained in Australia. They were buying equipment from the US, from Austria, from Switzerland. They were raising money from teachers' pension funds in the US, bringing that money to China to buy equipment from Europe, to produce panels in China, to sell to Germany, then to Spain. It was completely global. And that would, to me, that 2018 was the beginning of a change in that direction to make things less globalized. And it's really gone far since then. And it's not just Trump. It started with Obama putting tariffs on solar, and then the Biden administration continuing with industrial policy. And so to me, all of that slows down innovation because you're cutting off these flows of knowledge that have led to these really impactful technologies, primarily solar and electric vehicles. But so I guess the question is, could you have this kind of more isolated technology system where each country or Europe or emerging economies, because there's protection from tariffs and there's industrial policy, are able to reach scale faster? And so to me, it's kind of a competition between the benefits of not just trade, but the innovation system that's global, and maybe some benefits you get from dispersed innovation that's happening in local conditions that's protected and then scales up. And so far, we've gotten a lot out of this global system, and it'll be interesting to see if we can get some kind of similarly productive outcome from much more dispersed and isolated activity, because that's what the tariffs and the trade restraints and other types of kind of ending of collaborations and things like that are driving towards.
Yeah, Greg, that's an outstanding answer, and I don't really have much to add. Just I find the question really interesting too, and it seems like you mentioned this, protectionist policies would limit knowledge flow, but they also limit sort of market size, right? So you're sort of shrinking the potential pool of benefits to innovation in any individual country. So I mean, it seems to me at first blush that this would have to slow down innovation if you're going to have countries trying to do everything themselves. You're just not going to have the most potential kind of breakthroughs. The biggest potential breakthroughs would be sort of the incentives for those would be more limited. But I'd be really interested in academic papers. There must be a literature on this, I would think. I'm not exactly familiar with it, but it could be a really interesting topic now to come to the fore, especially with this. As you're right, it's definitely outside the U.S. as well. It's a broader phenomenon.
Great. Yeah, I know that there's a nice paper in Nature that's on quantifying the cost savings of global solar PV supply chains. Maybe I can put a link into the chat. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potentially good questions there for the community to unpack. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to add your Q&A into the chat here. We are taking questions for the remainder. I see, one of the other questions here relates to the trade-offs that I know Greg and others articulated earlier, that potentially technology advancements can, help to navigate some of those trade-offs in a way that, maybe is more affordable or more reliable. But, another one of the trade-offs too is that, when you think about either factor inputs like, critical minerals, and potential issues associated with those, whether that's cost, human rights, others. How do you see innovation kind of navigating those additional trade-offs that are kind of in the upstream associated with these technologies?
Yeah, maybe I can just offer a little bit of perspective. I think it's a really important question. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the kinds of technological shift that you're talking about when you're talking about decarbonization is you're moving from a fuel-based economy to a sort of energy system to a manufacturing-based energy system. Like everything is capital, and everything is. So you have this very different. We're used to sort of fuels moving around, and what are the economic implications of these fuel markets? But now you're talking about sort of a manufacturing base, as you're building batteries and wind and solar turbines and other pieces of capital that are going to be the what's providing the energy, and those that's a different kind of dynamic, and that has implications for trade, but also has implications for kind of what the associated environmental impacts are. And I guess the question around sort of rare earths or other factors that kind of influence those manufacturing processes. I mean, now you're talking about sort of complementary policies driving innovation in those areas. So as the decarbonization policies shift to a different type of energy system, then you have these other sort of emerging policy goals to have kind of manage the implications of that. So I think there's kind of overlapping. It's got to be a policy change as well that sort of starts to bring in those priorities as the nature of the supply chain, energy supply chain shifts.
Yeah, and I would just raise, I mean, I like this, the way Jeff put it about the shift from fuels to manufacturing, and that really changes, like, it makes a bigger role for industrial policy and energy than before. But you can also think about substitution happening with these inputs. They're not fixed like they were with fossil fuels. It's not like you have to have gas to burn gas. You used to need more cobalt to make lithium ion batteries, and there's been a really quick substitution away from cobalt to sulfur and other materials for anodes and cathodes. And it's really been impressive how flexible and responsive to price and other human rights and trade issues some of that has been. And I think that's something that makes me fairly optimistic about energy storage and battery storage in particular. Is there's a fair number of open pathways about materials to use and configurations, and long ways to go. And lithium ion has become dominant because of learning by doing and economies of scale and learning effects, but it doesn't need to stay that way. And even within lithium ion, the substitution that's happened already has been, I think, pretty encouraging for us not to get stuck into something that's ends up having downsides. It goes back to this diversification point that Jeff made earlier.
I think also this is with the supply chain, I think from globalization to deglobalization, I think manufacturers are seeing the risks as well, the supply chain risks, and then I think definitely the national policies like help to advance innovation, like for the rare earth materials. Like I've been reading, there's like these synthetic versions that could be manufactured in the US to like to replace, like substitute some of the inputs going into the advanced technologies. But then of course they need support in terms of like the national policy regulation and also investment, like the risk, almost like some guaranteed, like so then their investments will be not jeopardized, or so then the risk needs to be managed, I think, properly. So then as we, I think, transform from this like more global economy to each country on their own type stuff, I think the views need to be, I think, shift in terms of the maybe more security, like the supply chain stuff maybe becomes more compact, but then they need like support, right, from like bunch of entities, and also the banks need to be like securing, like, okay, this is good, we need to do this, that. So I think it's just like multiple levels, not just policy, but R&D and also finance as well.
Yeah, all excellent points. And I guess it comes back to me that there are many emerging technologies that hold promise for decarbonizing both on the supply side and the demand side. But several of these options that appear in these net zero scenarios in particular, those technologies have a high ratio of power points to actual projects. And I'm curious about your thoughts on what the macro energy systems community, what role can we play in providing this sort of actionable information to folks like technology developers, the policymakers, and investors about those technological options?
Yeah, plenty of vaporware, and hard to tell the difference. But I mean, I guess some basic things that you can look at is kind of from just first is like from a technological understanding, are these do these kind of fit with, second law of thermodynamics, and is there actually a functioning system that makes sense? How mature is it? That's one thing. I think, is there a pathway to lowering costs that's credible? What does it compete with, and what is the trajectory of that? So I think one thing I would think about, like if we think about small modular reactors, in, like we were talking, the 2030s for data centers, they're not competing with the technology we have in 2025. They'll be competing with something different in 10 years. And so being realistic about them competing with potentially uh, with a moving target. And then, is there an initial niche market that could move? Is there a reason that policy support could be there and be there long enough to sustain it? So yeah, I mean, usually just questions to ask, but yeah, definitely a recurring issue about how to evaluate lots of interesting, cool sounding ideas that come out of creative minds.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo the the point about the competition, right? Putting these new technologies, like, okay, suppose you achieve your technical goals, like how does that work in a energy system in the time frame where you could actually achieve those goals? Energy system with other technology advances and other policy changes, other structural changes. So really trying to use the models to, you're not trying to predict deployment, but you're trying to say, well, suppose there is this deployment. How do these interactions work economically, right? What is the economic case? Because I think a lot of the technological, research kind of maybe sweeps under the rug or does on the back of the envelope kind of some of the, economics, and doesn't really have the tools to think through how would this actually, how would this technology dispatch? If I put an electrolyzer in, what's going to be the capacity factor? Because I'm going to have that cost of electricity is going to affect my incentives to operate, and so does the policy environment. And so, how am I actually going to use this, and how does that affect the value of the investment and the way this technology could be sort of feasibly deployed? And I just think that that kind of information that comes from the kind of tools that this community runs and develops often does not reach the sort of technology developers or even the finance folks. You have a conversation with the people who are potentially financing these projects. I don't think they understand this stuff very well at all. So trying to inject that analytical perspective into the connection of the money to the technological developers, I think it's just super valuable.
I think I want to add in macro energy systems, like a more modeling nerdish stuff. I've been recently seeing more and more analysis that incorporates this TRL levels of different technologies, like technology readiness levels. I think that type of analysis and like presenting to decision makers, stakeholders would be really interesting, and then putting that thing in the scenario framework, because one technology's TRL might be higher than the other, so then we can look at like that would be more like uncertain, so more like fuzzy looking. So then how all those things compete with each other in the future projection of the energy systems, that could be, I think, really interesting, like a future direction that I think we might need to adopt as modelers.
Great. And as we're wrapping up, I'm curious if folks have a very succinct sort of need for the macro energy systems community in terms of reaching outside of the community to other literatures, other types of frameworks in order to inform these questions about advanced technologies.
Well, John, I'll just make a plug, and this is something that I know you understand well because you do a great job of it. Communication is really important. So we do a lot of, I think, really interesting and sophisticated and cutting edge analysis, but the communication piece of it, distilling it to decision makers and folks either in industry or in government or even the public, right? If you're talking about adoption decisions. Kind of what this means and how to use it is really important. So don't shortchange that part of your research.
I think there would be like transparency, like the most of the decision makers, like stakeholders, view these models as black box. So having like proper documentation, openness, I think that just helps build trust. So then we can actually make the connection like better. So then they might start listening, and we might just like get more input from them. So I think that's very essential, like moving towards more like open data. And also updating the models. Like I've been seeing like a lot of models still use really old data.
Yeah. And I would just add in addition to communication and trust and updating the models, is just somehow conveying the timeframes that we're talking about, because there's often years that are beyond people's normal day-to-day lives or even business planning. But the key is that a lot of the decisions that we make in 2025 and the next couple of years constrain our options in the 2030s and beyond. And so making clear to people that some of these outcomes and modeling of the longer term future are meant to inform decisions today. And Jeff said that earlier, and I think that's an important point to get people's understanding of the relevance and the salience of this long-term modeling for decisions in the near term.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Greg. And I constantly reminding people that we're closer to 2050 now than we are to the release of Titanic, the movie, as hard as that is to believe. But yeah, speaking of time, we're already past the top of the hour. So please join me in thanking my three panelists. And I also want to thank all of you for your good participation today. Look forward to seeing you all on a future Macro Energy Systems webcast. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.